coming up. Blood magic, magic runes, and a wizard's staff has a knob on the end. Shout out in the comments if you recognise any of the books on these shelves. Welcome to episode 4 of my series, A History of Witchcraft and Magic in Europe. Today we are focusing on the Viking Age. I have defined the Viking Age very broadly and vaguely. Basically, there's some crossover with episode 3 on the Celtic world. We're looking at the early medieval period, the European Iron Age, and then into a little bit of the later medieval period as well. Also, very much like the evidence for the Celtic world, the evidence for the Viking Age is a combination of sagas, which are fiction, poetry, but based on history and oral tradition, alongside archaeological evidence. The sagas are written down much later than the period we're really focusing on and looking for evidence for by Christian writers. We're looking for evidence of pagan witchcraft and pagan practices, but all of the written evidence is coming from Christians who are therefore looking at it from the outside. But by pairing it up with archaeological evidence, we can try and build a picture of what Viking pagan witchcraft and magic looked like. There were two gods in the Norse pantheon who were particularly associated with magic. That was Odin, who I am going to anglicise as Odin, and Freya. Do you know any magic, Freya? We can get a sense of Odin's magical power from a poem called Havamal, the Sayings of the High One. This is a poem from the collection known as the Poetic Edda. The earliest manuscript of the Poetic Edda comes from about 1270, but the poems themselves are almost certainly older than that. The poem describes how Odin sacrifices himself to himself, which is quite an achievement, and in so doing acquires runes, 9 mighty songs, fecundity, and knowledge. He claims to know 18 different charms covering such areas including courage on the battlefield, weather, counter-charms against hostile magic, defence against hags, that word is tunridor, settling discord, communicating with the dead, and seducing women. And we will see nearly all of these reflected in some of the Nordic magical practices that we're looking at throughout this episode. The goddess Freya is also associated with magic and with enchantment. The Ynglingasaga, which is part of Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla, a chronicle of the kings of Norway, says that Freya taught Seidr or Seidr to the Aesir. The Aesir are the major Norse gods, and she taught it to them because it was a custom among her people, the Vanir. The Vanir are a subordinate group of gods, and we will talk about Seidr or Seidr a little bit later on. The Norse sagas were written in the mid to later medieval periods. They are probably based on earlier oral histories, and that's why we use them for evidence of the earlier pagan period that we don't have written evidence for otherwise, other than some inscriptions. There are several genres of saga. King's sagas, which are histories of kings, the Islandigasögur, which are histories of the settlement and colonisation of Iceland, contemporary sagas, which tell histories from the time the sagas are actually written, around the kind of 13th century and thereabouts, chivalric sagas, which can be translations from French chansons de geste or Latin poems, or they might be original Icelandic compositions, legendary sagas covering Scandinavian myth and legend from the period before the settlement of Iceland, and saints and bishops sagas, which are translations of hagiographies, that's saints' lives, or hagiographies of Scandinavian saints. Stephen A. Mitchell has pointed out that the contemporary sagas, the ones set in that later medieval period when they're actually written down, don't feature anything like as much magic as the sagas that are set in earlier periods. They feature very little magic and hardly any magical practitioners. But the non-contemporary sagas include so much magic. I'm going to give a couple of examples in this video, and I'm barely scratching the surface. I'm going to put the various books that I've consulted on this topic in the description. If you're interested, please do go and get those books, especially Stephen Mitchell's book and Neil Price's book, which are brilliant resources. There is so much that I can't fit in this video. So the sagas are absolutely full of wizards and sorcerers and wise women and magic, and it's just recurring throughout all of them, or at least all of the non-contemporary ones. Mitchell suggests that the single most celebrated description of magic in the Nordic sources is a detailed description of the performance of a magical practitioner in the Saga of Erik the Red. So that's going to be my first example. I'm going to read out some of this saga because it is such a full and fascinating depiction of the kind of workings of a witch, a sorceress, a seer, whatever term we want to use, which we think probably does reflect pagan practice at least a little bit. The Saga of Erik the Red is a 13th century Icelandic saga about the Viking settlement in Greenland and about the exploration of North America. And it covers some of the same material as the later 14th century saga of the Greenlanders. And the story here relates to a settlement in Greenland called Herjulfsnes, and this is Mitchell's translation of this section of the saga, slightly edited by me. At that time there was a great famine in Greenland. Men who went out hunting for food had little success, and some never came back. There was a woman in the settlement named Thorbjorg. She was a seeress, and the word used here is spakona. She was called the Little Sibyl, that's Mitchell's translation. The word is Little Vulva. This is a word that is often used for a female seer or witch or magical practitioner of some kind. She had 9 sisters, all of whom were seeresses, that's spakono, but she was the only one still alive. Thorkel invited the seeress to his home, and she was well received there, as was the custom with such women. She was dressed like this. She had on a blue cloak with straps and set with stones all the way down to the hem. She had on a necklace of glass beads, and on her head a black lambskin hood lined with white catskin, and she held a staff in her hand which had a knob on it, bound with brass and set with stones below the knob. She had around her middle a belt of touchwood, and on it a great pouch in which she kept the charms she needed for her witchcraft. The word here is fröðleikur. The etymology is from words for knowing, learned or well-informed. On her feet she had hairy calfskin shoes with long laces which terminated in large pewter buttons. On her hands she had catskin gloves which were hairy and white inside. The next day, as it got late, she was supplied with what she needed to perform the witchcraft. The word used here is seidr or seidr. She asked for the aid of women who had that knowledge which was necessary to the witchcraft called warlock songs. The word here is varðlokur, but no such women were found. Then an inquiry was made among the household to see if anyone knew them, that's the songs. Guthríður says then, and we've moved into the vivid present that's often used in epic poetry to make events seem more immediate. We suddenly switch from the past tense to the present tense. Guthríður says then, "I am neither a sorceress nor a witch, but in Iceland my foster mother Haldis taught me a song which she called the warlock songs," same word, varðlokur. Thorkel says, "Then you are wise at just the right moment." She says, "This is the sort of affair I want no part of, for I am a Christian woman," that's Guthríður, obviously, not Thorkel. But Thorkel pressures Guthríður, and she says she will do as he asks. The women now formed a circle around the scaffold upon which Thorbjorg sat, that's the seeress. Guthríður, the Christian woman who's reluctantly taking part, sang the song so beautifully and well that no one who was there believed they had heard more beautifully sung songs. The seeress thanked her for the song and said, "Many spirits have come here and think it beautiful to hear the song so well delivered. Spirits who previously stayed away and would not grant us obedience. And I can say this to you, Thorkel, that this famine will not last longer than this winter, and things will improve with the spring. The epidemic which has been on us will improve more quickly than expected. And as for you, Guthríður, I will reward you right away for your help, for your future is laid out before me. You will make a most distinguished match here in Greenland, although it will not last long, for your paths lead to Iceland." This text is written by a much later Christian author, and for all we know, he or she could be completely making it up, but it does seem to reflect older Norse practices. These are oral histories, and they are intended to preserve the histories of the people, so they are supposed to genuinely reflect the past, even if there has been some artistic license taken in places. And we do have an example of a burial where the woman seems to be wearing a similar kind of costume, outfit, to that described as belonging to the seeress in the poem. The grave comes from a 10th century cemetery at Firkat in Denmark. The woman was buried in a wagon, and she was dressed in a blue costume of very good quality, with red details and ornamentation in gold thread across the chest area. They also found several objects in a position that might suggest they hung from a belt, though there's no buckle or belt mount. And actually that makes sense if we look at the text, because the text specifically mentions that she had a belt of touchwood, and of course the wood wouldn't survive, or might not survive, in the burial. The woman buried at Firkat was also wearing 2 silver toe rings, which are completely unique in a Viking Age context. So wearing unusual jewellery suggests a person with an unusual status, a person with maybe connections with foreign places, who trades, who is deliberately set out from everybody else in some way. She was buried with a number of grave goods, including small bronze and copper bowls, a box brooch that had contained white makeup, which again could have been used to make her stand out visually from everyone else, a sheathed knife, and a number of small objects that were either jewellery or amulets of some kind. And obviously the line between jewellery and a protective amulet is very thin indeed. It's, I guess, the purpose for which you wear it and whether or not it specifically has a protective purpose is, I suppose, the difference. Everything I'm wearing right now would be jewellery. If I was wearing one of my cross necklaces, would it be jewellery? Would it be an amulet? Probably still jewellery, because I don't believe there's any kind of power attached to the necklace itself. But if someone wears a St. Christopher, is that an amulet? It's a very fine line. And if all you've got is the items and there's no inscription to identify them as a protective amulet, then it's very difficult to know which is which. The jewellery did, though, include a small silver pendant in the form of a chair of a kind found in other female graves with possible links to the practice of sorcery, along with fragments of a sheepskin pouch. The woman at Firkat was also buried with an oak box containing high-status folded clothes, a pair of shears, a clay spindle haul, and the lower jawbone of a young pig, and a clump of carefully preserved owl pellets. Ew. And these may also have been associated with magic or magical practices. Carrying around random animal bones is often associated with magical practices, and it's hard to imagine a non-magical reason for carrying around dried and carefully preserved owl poo. So you can see how the description in the saga, despite being written so much later and by a Christian, does genuinely seem to reflect things that were true of pagan magic, assuming that this woman, like the woman in the poem, was a magical practitioner of some kind, and that her blue cloak and amulets and pig bones and owl pellets mark her out as such.
Another way we can try to fill some of the gaps in the evidence is by looking at similar customs from related cultures. This is Oswald the Anglo-Saxon leech from UK reenactment group The Vikings. The Anglo-Saxons, a name we give to several groups of Germanic peoples who migrated over to England during the early medieval period, were similar in many ways and had the same Germanic roots as the Norse people. A leech was a medical practitioner who used a combination of practices we might recognise as more similar to scientific methods and also magical methods. Here, Oswald explains some elements of Anglo-Saxon medicine that crossed over into magical territory.
So, I don't know if you've ever seen anything like this before. It's actually a fossil called a belemnite. It's a little fossilised squid. But the Anglo-Saxons, they'd find that, or they'd find little stone arrowheads like this.
Yeah.
And
that I recognise from an archaeological dig many years ago.
So they actually thought this was evidence of elves going around shooting people. So if you get sudden stabbing pain like a stitch, it's because your horse goes lame, it's because you've been shot by an elf. So actually,
That's
as well as
amazing.
the kind of the more herbal side of things, that the leeches would also sell amulets and things to kind of keep you safe from elves and dwarves and things like that.
Some problems required some interesting ingredients. This, for example, is a very private part of a deer.
This would be something that you might give to a man who's maybe has some issues in the bedroom. So again, this is much more of obviously a magical remedy rather than a scientific remedy. But the Anglo-Saxons don't seem to really have distinguished between them. This this is how the world works, and there's plants which heal you, and there's magical things that heal you, and prayer, and whether that's to kind of Christian gods or kind of pagan gods.
There are quite a few Old Norse terms associated with magic. Some of the main ones, and I'm not going through all of them, include fjolkungi, fröðleika, or trolldómur, all of which mean kind of witchcraft broadly speaking. Galdr, a specific form of sorcery involving a type of high-pitched singing. And seidr, or seidr. Seidr, I believe, is more correct. Seidr refers especially to divination and divinatory rituals, but can also refer to healing the sick, bringing good luck, controlling the weather, or calling game animals and fish, as well as the opposite of these things. Curses, blighting the land to make it barren, making people ill, telling false futures to mislead people, or even causing physical injury, whether in a domestic setting or especially in battle. There are also various affixes, so parts of words you can add to another word to imply a person, god, or being has magical knowledge, like visenda, kunata, and similar words used for those who know. They're connected with knowing. It's connected with the words that lead to cunning, and the phrase cunning folk, often used in English for magical practitioners of various kinds. It's because magic is very much about knowledge. In societies where books are more central to the culture, then magic is often preserved in magic books, like in the story of the Sorcerer's Apprentice, which goes all the way back to Roman period Egypt, which is very much into books as a culture. That's where the Library of Alexandria was. But for an oral culture, like Viking and Celtic cultures, the knowledge is contained in words and memories, and it's passed down by people. You can't consult a magic book, you have to consult a magic person. This is the person who has the knowledge of the words and the knowledge of the magic. And that is how you access the magic in a culture that does not emphasise writing. It wasn't an illiterate culture. The Vikings absolutely had writing, and we'll see the importance of runes shortly, but a culture that prioritises oral tradition. The magical knowledge will be contained within people rather than books. There's also a word specifically referring to female magical practitioners, spakona, prophecy woman or wife, and women are more often associated with trolldommer than men, but it can apply to either. And looking at that important word, seder, divination, but also other magical practices, Neil Price has also noted that its medieval meanings are not quite the same as its use in modern neo-shamanism, though they are obviously related. They're similar, but they're not quite exactly the same. Norse people and Norse cultures in the medieval period were also in contact with the Sámi, who are the indigenous peoples of the very northern part of Europe. They live in the northernmost parts of the Scandinavian peninsula, across Sweden, Norway and Finland, and also in the Kola Peninsula in Russia. So the Germanic Norse peoples had migrated into Scandinavia from the south. The Sámi are indigenous peoples of the north. In Old Norse sources, they are often called Finns or Lapps, but they are a separate, though related group to Finns, who are the indigenous people of Finland across the whole country, not just the north, and many prefer not to be referred to as Lapps or Laplanders these days because those terms have derogatory connotations. Neil Price has suggested that the Norse Seder rituals could be compared with a similar Sámi practice called Noaidevota, and I apologise for my pronunciation on that. It certainly seems likely that those cultures who would be coming into contact with each other would then influence each other's traditions and practices. In Norse tradition, the Sámi are presented as especially powerful in magic, so much so that a term like finfr, which literally means fin trip, meant to visit the Sámi in order to inquire about the future. So in some cases, Norse people would go and visit the Sámi in order to access their magical and divinatory practices rather than relying on their own. The sagas and the archaeological record from Scandinavia feature all the same sorts of curses and charms that we've come to expect from our earlier explorations of Greek and Roman and Celtic magic, especially Greek and Roman. There are general curses, healing charms, protective charms, amulets, and of course the category euphemistically known as love magic, which usually has nothing to do with love whatsoever. This can include spells used to make somebody have relations with somebody else, which Mitchell notes are usually used by men, or spells to prevent somebody else from having relations, either with a specific other person or with anybody, which Mitchell notes are usually used by women. And we also have real-life examples, and these can be just as unpleasant as the Greco-Roman examples. So I'm just going to give one example that I'm going to heavily censor, but you get the gist. A small wooden stick from Bergen reads in runes, "You will, censored, Ranvig the Red. It will be bigger than a man's censored and smaller than a horse's censored." If you can't fill in the words that I censored there, you'll work it out as you get older. But I'm not saying that on a YouTube video. But you get the gist. It's not nice. But of course, there's lots of other types of magic and magical practices other than the love magic. A lot of evidence for charms comes from the sagas, but there is archaeological evidence for the use of charms as well. We saw the pig's jawbone and owl pellets in the grave from Firkat, which presumably have some kind of magical purpose and may have been used in some kind of charm. Pig's jawbones are also found in several 10th century graves from Birka in Sweden. These include the grave of a decapitated woman in which her head had been placed under the right arm while the pig's jawbone was laid across her severed neck. Not clear what's going on there, but maybe it's supposed to stop her rising from the grave or stop people messing with the grave. There are also deposits of unburnt jawbones in cremation burials at Birka. They were all placed in the graves after other rituals had been completed, so their purpose might be to guard the corpse or protect others from the corpse, or to react in some way to a power thought to be present in the grave and its occupant. And Scandinavian ghost stories from this period usually feature not ethereal ghosts, but physical revenants. And I've looked at that in a previous video on the Drauga, so I'll link that in the description below. But ideally, with archaeological evidence, what we really want is some writing to tell us what the thing is used for. And fortunately, we do have examples of that too, because key to Old Norse magic was runes. Runes are a specific type of lettering, so the language is Old Norse, and the lettering is runes. You might be familiar with it from fantasy literature, but they are, of course, very real. The reason that they are so straight is it makes it easier to inscribe them on things. You can see rune stones all over Scandinavia, but especially in Sweden. And in Sweden, they do have loads and loads of rune stones just kind of sitting out around as you walk around. They've been preserved and they've been sort of cleaned up. A lot of the time they've actually filled in the letters with red so that you can see them fairly well. When I first visited, I wasn't sure about that because the historian in me was a bit kind of, don't mess with the history, don't mess with the archaeology. But it does make it a lot clearer to see what they are, to understand what you're looking at, and they do have a lot of them. The runestones are mostly memorials to people who had died, though not necessarily at their burial site, but some of them do include curses on anyone who desecrates the stone. And then a lot of magical practices that we have evidence for, either from the archaeology or from the sagas, involves the use of runes and the carving of runes. For example, we have a runic amulet on copper found in Sigtuna, Uppland in Sweden. It was carved in Bustrophedon, a style of writing in which alternate lines of writing are reversed with letters also written in reverse. So you can see how the act of writing and the style of writing is unusual. It's not like you're writing a letter. There is thought and care put into it. It is a special type of writing, as well as being in runes in the first place. The amulet says, Boil or spectre of the wound fever, lord of the giants or trolls. The word troll can be used for quite a lot of different things in Old Norse. We've seen trolldommer is witchcraft, so it doesn't just mean your traditional, what you might picture as a troll. Has a fairly broad range of meanings. Flee now, you are found. On the other side, it says, have for yourself 3 pangs, wolf. Have for yourself 9 needs, wolf. Make good use of the healing charm. So it's obviously some kind of healing amulet used in medical practices, as we've already seen evidence for from Greece and Rome.
You can see a lovely example of one of these smaller charms among Oswald the Leech's wares, a replica from an archaeological find from Sweden.
This is actually a spindle, and it's got a charm written on it that says, may the person who wears the clothes made of the wool that's woven, that's spun with a spindle, be protected. So you're actually weaving the charm into the clothes as you make it.
Runes were often carved into sticks or bones. Obviously anything wooden hasn't necessarily survived, but the bones have survived a bit better. These were not just used for magic. Some of them are actually just short messages and letters. Some of them are labels, business deals, religious texts, and love notes, but some of them clearly have a magical purpose. Interestingly, runes on bones are also found in Slavic contexts, and they have a very long history describing Germanic tribes. Tacitus, the Roman author, in his Germania, described how they would cast lots using strips from a nut-bearing tree, which they would mark with what Tacitus called signs, and then throw randomly onto a white cloth. Now, we don't know that the signs Tacitus describes were runes, because he isn't any more descriptive than that, but it certainly seems likely, it's certainly very possible that these are actually runes being carved and then thrown up in the air onto a cloth for the purposes of divination. Runes can also be inscribed onto staffs or magic wands. Neil Price has divided these staffs that appear in the sagas into a few different categories. There's the staffer, an attribute of the vulva, female seeress, probably used for summoning spirits and for divination. The seidstaffer, similar, attributes of seeresses and could be very large. So obviously magic wand, I think most of us are probably picturing like Harry Potter. A staff, we're probably picturing Gandalf. Basically, these could be any of those two or anything in between, really. There's a lot of variation. Price notes that there was one specific to supernatural beings that therefore we wouldn't expect to see in the archaeology, which is the Jarnstaffer. Also the Staffsprota, an attribute of the Spakona, that's that female magical practitioner we mentioned earlier, used to strike an enemy directly or rob an enemy of his memory. There's one called the Voro, which has phallic connotations, so possibly used more by men. Another one, the Gandar or Gondol, probably used for summoning spirits and to injure others, and also associated with the love magic. And finally, the Gambantine or Tamsvonder, used for severely disordering an enemy's mind and again for love magic. In the sagas, many of these staffs are made of wood and therefore we wouldn't necessarily expect to find examples of them, but iron staff-like objects have been found in graves from all over Scandinavia, especially in Norway, and a small number have managed to survive in wood as well. Wood will survive if it's kind of in a bog where there's no access to oxygen, or if it's high up a mountain where it's frozen. Yeah, there are certain geographical locations where wood manages to survive. Obviously, most of the surviving examples are not wood, but there are some. And these staffs include examples from the graves at Birka and at Firkat that we've already talked about. And some of them, as you can see here, have knob-like mounts on the shafts. And apologies to anyone not familiar with Terry Pratchett's Discworld, but every time I read about that, all I can think is Nanny Og singing a wizard's staff has a knob on the end. But Pratchett knew his stuff. He was very well versed in folklore, and a wizard's staff does indeed have a knob on the end. I want to finish this episode with one more example from the sagas that brings together some of these things that I've been talking about in another quite detailed description of magical practices, and that also introduces the idea of blood magic into the mix as well. In Grettir's saga, one of Grettir's enemies, Thorbjorg, has an old foster mother called Thurid, who has a reputation as a witch. The saga says, when she was young and people were still pagan, she had been skilled in magic and sorcery. Even though the country had become Christian, many sparks of heathenism remained. The law here in the land was that sacrificing or performing pagan rites was not banned if done in private, but if such acts were carried out in public, the punishment was lesser outlawry. For many, youthful habits remained, and there were many people who were set in their ways. And this poem is well aware that people do not change their religious beliefs overnight. There are so many examples throughout history of rulers, from Akhenaten in Egypt to Mary I in England, trying to overnight declare what people's religion is going to be. And people wanting to suck up to the ruler will go with it, but you cannot simply change people's entire belief systems like that. It doesn't work that way. And it doesn't matter when a ruler says, right, we're not this religion anymore, we're this one now. People will continue practicing old religions for a very long time after that point, unless they have genuinely converted to the new religion themselves, and not everybody is going to do that all at once. But Thurid in this saga was born before the Christianization of the area anyway, so she has learned pagan magical practices in her youth. Thurid comes with her foster son Thorbjorg to confront Grettir, hiding in the bottom of his boat, and then when she speaks up, Grettir hits her with a stone and breaks her thigh. I have to say, I've read bits of Grettir's saga, and Grettir is not somebody I like all that much, but maybe I need to read the other bits of the saga. Maybe there's bits where he's more likeable. I don't have a whole lot of sympathy for him here, I've got to say. A little later, when she has started to heal, she asks Thorbjorg to drive her to the beach. On the shore is a tree trunk with roots attached, and she has the men shave a spot on it, and then she carves runes on the root where they've shaved it. And the saga says, reddening the letters with her own blood as she chanted spells. So of course, looking for evidence of blood magic is quite tricky, because you would need the blood to have survived for that long, and it's organic, and it's often on wood, which is also organic, so the chances of finding physical evidence of something like this are pretty slim. It could be a Christian author kind of making even more of pagan magical practices than was already there, or it could be a real survival from pagan practice. There's really no way to know for sure. Then Thurid walks backwards around the trunk, counter to the sun's course, while pronouncing powerful charms over it. After that, she has the men push it back into the sea and speaks a spell so that it will come to Grettir and do harm to him. The trunk washes up near where Grettir is, and he sees it but says it's evil and they shouldn't use it and chucks it back in the sea. But it washes up a second and then a third time. Grettir then tries to chop it up with an axe, but the axe glances off the tree trunk and badly cuts him to the bone in the knee. The wound gets infected, Grettir sickens and eventually dies from it. So this magic is considered powerful enough to kill the strong hero of the saga. He is actually finally killed after all sorts of adventures with draugrs and monsters and trolls and all sorts of things. He is killed by witchcraft. And this does seem clearly related to the various archaeological evidence we've talked about. It's got the carving of the runes, it's got the knowledge of the spells and incantations by a woman who knows this ancient wisdom, who is doing pagan magical practices, even though the place has been Christianized. And the carving of the runes into a tree trunk seems to echo the use of staffs as well. So we can see that it does seem like there is some evidence of ancient Norse pagan practices preserved in these Christian poems, even though they've been written down by somebody of a different religion at a much later date. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like. This is the 4th episode in my History of Witchcraft and Magic series, so do check out episodes 1, 2 and 3 on ancient Greece, ancient Rome and the Celtic world. Subscribe to my channel for myth, legend, folklore, ghost stories and weird and wonderful history in general. Until next time, bye!